Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 4. We're going to be looking at the rewriting process, or as some of you may have referred to it in the past, the revision process. So we are looking at how you take your draft and use feedback from your instructor, feedback from your peers, and just your own reading of your draft to make changes and make it stronger, how to revise it so that it is even better than it was the first time around. So the first thing that you need to realize about the revision process is that there are levels to it, stages, if you will. And we want to go from global to local. So we want to start with the bigger issues first and work our way down to the tinier details. So those four levels are, level 1 is global revision. Level 2 is what we call substantive editing. Level 3 is what we call copy editing. And level 4 is what we call proofreading. We're going to go through each of these levels and see what each one is all about, the kinds of things you should be looking at when you're tackling each level. What I will say right away, though, is most people, when they are asked to make revisions or told that they have to make revisions, or that they, take a look at your paper and see what needs to be changed, or they exchange papers in class with a peer, and the instructor says, okay, you need to do a peer review, look through your peer's draft and let them know what they need to improve on. Many of us skip right to level 4 and do proofreading, which is looking for spelling and grammar and mechanics errors. And that is actually the last thing you want to do in this process. So please pay attention to what we're going to talk about for those first 3 levels, because it may be things that you haven't had to look at before when you've been asked to read a peer's paper or revise your own. Just keep that in mind. The small details get saved for last. So the first level is global revision. Again, global, bigger. So what we're really talking about here are sort of like the foundation of your essay. Because if your foundation isn't strong, it doesn't matter what you've built on the foundation, it will crumble. So you want to make sure that, and these are things that hopefully you did beforehand, so that this step of the revision process goes quickly and smoothly. But if you skipped the pre-writing and planning stages and you just jumped right in to typing up a rough draft, then you may have some problems here at the first level of the revision process. Hopefully not, though. But what we're talking about are, first, your topic. Is your topic focused? And have you successfully developed the topic within the essay? Meaning, did you really flesh it out and explain every element of the topic? Or did you just have to give a brief overview because the topic was so big that to fit it into 4 or 5 pages, you couldn't really go into a lot of detail? You had to just give us a brief overview of everything. That's typically not what you're supposed to do in an essay. So if that is what you've done, then you may have a problem. That's why we use those pre-writing strategies in the beginning, to make sure that the topic is focused and narrow enough that you can fully develop it within the constraints of the assignment. You want to think about your angle. Have you said something new about your topic? Is your point of view unique? Or are you simply regurgitating information or repeating things that other people have already said? Most of the time, that's also not what you're supposed to do in an essay. Sometimes it is. Every once in a while, you'll be given an assignment where it pretty much is just like summarize what all of these people have already said. And if that's the case, then it is what it is. But the majority of the time, when you're given an assignment that requires some type of essay, regardless of length, you're probably expected to say something new or unique about your topic, to bring something new to the table. Have you done that? Purpose is probably topic is the first most important thing. Purpose is definitely right up there. It's a very close second to making sure that your topic is focused enough. But your purpose, remember, is why did you choose this topic? Why did you develop it the way that you chose to? And what do you want your readers to take away from the essay? So, is that clear from the beginning to the end of the essay? Is it clear why you're writing about this topic and what you want us to get from it? That needs to be clear. If you don't have a purpose behind the essay, it will wander. It will just twist and turn, and your reader won't really know why you wrote it or how they're supposed to react to it. So the purpose needs to be solid from the beginning. Have you thought about your readers, who they might be, what their point of views might be? Have you anticipated any questions they might have, or anticipated anything they might need from you in the essay? Background information, more explanation about a certain idea. Have you thought about the readers? And then context. Have you connected the topic to the real world in some way outside of this little assignment? And is your tone appropriate for the assignment, given what the assignment asked of you, along with what your purpose is? Have you used an appropriate tone throughout the whole essay to help achieve that purpose? Right? You need to make sure that all of those things are set. If you answer no to any of those questions, then you might have a problem. If you answer no to a lot of them, then you definitely have a problem. And you need to address those issues before you move on to the next stage of the revision process. If you don't have a focused enough topic that you can develop well, if you don't even know why you're writing it, you need to kind of go back and rethink some things, and you may even have to do a little more pre-writing, and you may, more than likely, you'll have to do another rough draft, because there's no way to fix anything else in the essay if this global level isn't solid. The foundation has to be solid. Hopefully, though, like I said, you thought about all of these things in the beginning when you were doing your pre-writing and your planning and you were thinking about the essay. Hopefully, all of these things you can just check off real quick and move right on to the next step. Okay? The next step is substantive editing. So here we're going to look at content, organization, and design if necessary. So content is literally your ideas, right? Do you have a clear and concise claim or thesis statement? Remember, that should be in your introductory paragraph, and it should be a single sentence that tells the reader exactly what the focus of the essay is. And if it's a really good thesis statement, it will even include your plan of development, which is your main points. Are those main points clear? Even if they didn't get listed in the thesis statement, are they clear throughout the essay? Do you have a clear conclusion? So remember, those are the main elements of an essay: introductory paragraph, body paragraphs, concluding paragraph. And the body paragraphs are where you cover your main points. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have 3 main points, you have 3 body paragraphs. Sometimes it takes more than 1 paragraph to fully develop 1 main point. And that's fine. But is that main point clear? And is the next one clear? And the next one? Okay? We'll look at those individual paragraphs at the next step of the revision process. But just in general, is your thesis statement clear? Are your main points clear? Do you have a clear conclusion? If you answer no to any of those, you have some work to do before you move on to the next step. Think about your organization. Are those main points organized in a logical way? And if you did list them in the thesis statement, if you listed your main points in your thesis, make sure that the order you listed them in is the same order you discussed them in the body of the essay. The order is totally up to you. Just make sure it matches up. Make sure it's consistent. Now, thinking about how to organize it, we've talked about thinking of how to organize main ideas, how to create coherence. But basically, what will the reader respond best to? If you are dealing with anything that involves time, it might be best to organize the main points in time sequence, right? If you are dealing with anything persuasive, any type of argumentative essay, and persuasive does not mean full-on debate and argument. Persuasive can be very subtle. And that is the majority of the type of academic writing that we do. It is persuasive in nature. Sometimes you get assigned an essay where it is argumentative, where it is, clear that you are trying to convince your readers of something. But a lot of times it's not that obvious. It is more subtle, and it's not so in your face, and it's not necessarily with a topic that people are, passionate about. It's something that's just a little more subtle. But in those cases, you typically want to save your main point, like your biggest main point, your best main point, for last. So figure out in your mind, think about the reader, think about yourself, out of your main points, which one do you think carries the biggest punch? That is the most convincing, the most important. That's probably the one you want to save for last. And then work your way backwards to the least impressive, or maybe the one that you have the least to say about, the least support for, the easiest one for readers to kind of wrap their head around and agree with. Start with that one and work your way down to that most important one. Because we tend to remember what we hear or read last, so you want to end with the biggest punch because that's what the reader will most likely take away from the essay. But think logically. Put thought into how you want to organize the main points. What makes the most sense? If the organization is off in your draft, then you need to address that. You need to fix it. And that is typically not a terrible task to undertake if you had at least given some thought to the organization in the beginning. If you gave no thought to the organization and every body paragraph has 3 different topics going on in it, then you have your work cut out for you. Which is why planning is so important before you draft. But it is still not, a lost cause. You can still go through the essay and pick out your main points and then figure out a way to reorganize it. Looking at the design factor of substantive editing, that is making sure you have proper margins, making sure the spacing is correct, making sure the font is correct. If it's supposed to be in APA format, making sure all of those elements are formatted correctly. If you used sources, did you have correct citations? Do you have a correct reference page? Right? So the design of it. All right, so if you are looking at the substantive editing and you're looking at your content, the ideas you have in there, your main points, you might be asking yourself, is there anything that I should add or anything that I should take out? Well, the first thing you want to do then is to what I call reverse outline. So hopefully you had a step in towards the beginning of your process before you wrote your rough draft where you created a real brief outline of your essay. You know, what your thesis statement is, what each main point was going to be, maybe even what supporting details you were going to use for each main point, but maybe not. Maybe it was just, you know, clarifying what your main ideas were, and that's fine. Now you're going to do you're going to do it in the opposite order. Now you have the draft in front of you, and now you're going to reverse outline it. Look at your introductory paragraph. What does your thesis statement appear to be? What does your claim appear to be? Write that sentence at the top. And then look at your main points. What did each main point seem to be? All right. Then for each main point, what supporting details did you use? And this can be very brief. You don't have to write full sentences for any of this because it is just for you, and you'll know what you mean, you know, if you write down just a couple words. But thesis statement at the top, and then each main point, and not what you think or what you planned to have each main point be. Literally what the draft says each main point is. What does your draft say? Because you might have intended to have 4 main points in a very specific order, but because you didn't plan it or outline it, when you got in the middle of drafting, it went all over the place. Now look at what you actually produced. Look at the draft. What does it say each main point is? What supporting details are actually in that paragraph for that main point, right? So make sure that to check the outline. Look at your main points first. Make sure that each main point directly relates back to that thesis statement. That it clearly supports your claim, right? So if you look on slide 7, there's a sample outline of just the thesis statement and the main points of an essay about Evelyn. So you have your, Evelyn's short story by James Joyce. So in this essay, their thesis statement was, Evelyn refuses to leave with Frank because she fears failure. So their first main point for this is that her deathbed promise to her mother was unfair. Their second main point is she has good reason to want to leave her father. Her third main point, her home life is so unhealthy she should leave. The fourth main point is her only reason for staying is that she's afraid. And then their concluding idea was she retreats into the familiar to avoid risk. Right? So in this case, let's just make sure Evelyn refuses to leave Frank because she fears failure. Does each of those main points, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, do those main ideas seem to relate back to why Evelyn refuses to leave? Her deathbed promise to her mother was unfair. She has good reason to want to leave her father. Her home life is so unhealthy she should leave. Her only reason for staying is that she's afraid. Right now it looks like it's all helping to support that thesis statement. We might get a little more information and know for sure when we look at the supporting details. So, take that outline where you had your thesis statement and your main points, and now for each main point, add in the supporting details that you used for each main point. And then check to make sure in each body paragraph Look at your supporting details to be sure that each one relates directly to that topic sentence for that main point. Or did you pull in some stuff from the story or from your research that actually doesn't fit with that main point? Maybe it should go somewhere else. Make sure all the supporting details for that main point directly relate to that main point. Okay? Make sure that none of your supporting details repeat anything, unless it's being repeated for emphasis. But just make sure that it's not careless repetition. Decide if the support is adequate. Decide if you have enough for each main point, right? If you have a main point and you've only listed one supporting detail on your outline, that's a good indication that that main point probably needs more supporting details with it. If you decide, looking at your main points and the supporting details, if you decide that you don't have enough support for your topic sentence for that main point, you have some decisions to make. You can add to it, go and look for more supporting details to add to that main point, or maybe that main point wasn't as important as you originally thought it was. Maybe you don't need it. And especially if you don't have enough to say about it, maybe it's really not going to do a lot to help your thesis, right? And that's okay, you can get rid of it. Or it might be that it just needs to, maybe it needs to be incorporated into another paragraph. Maybe it actually could fit somewhere else. But just be sure to address the issue if you have a main point that lacks enough support. A decision needs to be made in some way, right? And then on slide 9, you can kind of see how, we took those main points from the first outline. So the introduction thesis statement is still, Evelyn refuses to leave with Frank because she fears failure. So remember, our first main point was her deathbed promise to her mother was unfair. The supporting detail that we have for that main point is it's unfair to ask Evelyn to give up her own life, which is what her mother did. For our second main point, point number 3, she has good reason to want to leave her father. And here's our supporting details for that main point. He's a drunk and takes advantage of the promise that she made to her mom. He's stingy. He abuses her verbally. He's a bully and might actually beat her, perhaps. He was sometimes fun in the past and played at picnics. Our third main point, point number 4 on the outline, her home life is so unhealthy she should leave. Our supporting details for that are, she doesn't feel a part of everything. I'm talking about the picture of the priest. The dust in the house represents the dirtiness and squalor of her life. Very unhealthy. And she thinks of leaving and remembers her dreary job. Our fourth main point, point number 5, her only reason for staying is that she's afraid. Our supporting details for that are, leaving the unfamiliar could mean failure. And then there's a quotation that they're about to explore. And explore suggests uncertainty. And life is hard, so she thinks of good memories to convince herself to stay. And then our concluding thought is still, she retreats into the familiar to avoid risk. She feels she has a right to happiness, but she decides a predictable life is better than one without direction and pattern. So let's look at each of these main points, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, you can see right away that the first main point needs more support. There's only one supporting detail there about her deathbed promise to her mother and how it was unfair. So we have to do something about that. In paragraph 3, which, is our second main point, so the last, she has, 5 details listed there, but if you look at that last one, because we're talking about how she has good reason to want to leave her father, and the rest of the list are all these negative things about her father. And then you get to this last one, it says, he was sometimes fun in the past and played at picnics. Well, that doesn't really fit in with the point of that paragraph, which are all the reasons that she has to leave her father, all the ways that he's not so great. So it doesn't make sense to talk about him being fun in the past. That doesn't fit into that main point. That probably just needs to go, possibly. We'll see maybe if it would fit somewhere else, but it definitely does not belong in that paragraph. The next main point, paragraph 4, this one is about how her home life is so unhealthy she should leave. And then we got doesn't feel part of everything, the dust in the house, dirty and squalor. And then we get this last main point, thinks of leaving and remembers her dreary job. That does not relate to the main point of that paragraph. So that supporting detail also needs to be taken out of that paragraph. Paragraph 5, the last point about Eveline's good memories provides a good place to move the example about fun in the past from the second main point. So, her only reason for staying is that she's afraid. Leaving the unfamiliar could mean failure. They're about to explore. And she is thinking of good memories to convince herself to stay, so that might be a good place to take that detail about how her father was sometimes fun at picnics and put that there, because she's thinking about things that were good in her life to make her stay. Alright, so that could just be switched there. Looking at the last paragraph, she retreats into the familiar to avoid risk. She feels she has a right to happiness. That doesn't really connect to retreating into the familiar to avoid risk. That feeling like she has a right to happiness does not fit with that main point. But it would fit with our very first main point about how her deathbed promise to her mother was unfair. So we could take that supporting detail from the 6th paragraph and move it with into the 2nd paragraph about the deathbed promise to her mother. So this particular outline did help us. We could see that we had solid main points, but then when we listed the supporting details, we could see that not all of them belonged where we had them. And in this case, we just needed to move some things around. Now, if we had not found something else to go in the 2nd body paragraph about her deathbed promise to her mother, if we had not found something else to go there, we might have had to go look in the story for more supporting details, and if we still couldn't find them, then we would have had to have made a decision about that first main point. Do we have enough support to leave it as a main point? Probably not. Do we need to get rid of it completely, or can we find a way to make it fit with one of our other main points? But luckily this time we did find more supporting evidence, and we found it in one of our other paragraphs. So that worked out quite nicely. But you can see how this helped to make sure that everything matched up, that we had solid main points that directly supported the thesis statement, and that we had specific and adequate supporting details for each of those main points. It was really easy to visually see it and then make some decisions about it. So don't skip the reverse outline. It is super helpful. And it might even help to put the draft away for a little while and then come back to it to try to do this in the revision process. Or you could ask someone to do it for you. Someone who, because sometimes we're so close to what we wrote, it's difficult for us to see it with an analytical eye. So if you have someone else do the outline for you, then that might help as well. You know, that little outline there is going to help with making sure all of your content is solid. But remember, organization was also one element of substantive editing, so you need to ask yourself, you know, what should I rearrange, if anything, right? And again, just think of, you know, should you arrange them? Should you arrange your main points from negative to positive, from most influential to least influential, general to specific, least impressive to most impressive? That's probably going to be the one that's used most often. But again, just looking at the outline, ask yourself if there's anything that needs to be rearranged. Does it make sense how you've ordered it? And seeing it in outline form can break that down for you visually as well. And you can see right there on the same page the order of all your ideas, instead of having to flip through, you know, 3 or 4 pages and not really being able to tell and see if everything is in the best order. Having it on the outline, you can go right through it and make sure that it is in the right order and rearrange things if needed. Once you've done that, you've made sure that the content is good, you've made sure that the order is good. Now, work on the flow, okay? Read it out loud. Reading it out loud will help you hear how it sounds. You can even record it and play it back. Or have a friend read it. Listen for anything that it sounds choppy or abrupt. Listen to make sure the ideas are arranged in a sequence that's easy to follow. And make sure that you have good connections between sentences and between paragraphs. So use those transitions. You want a clearly sequenced flow of ideas. You want transitional terms and echo terms. You want to repeat key terms. And sometimes that's verbatim, and sometimes it's just using a different version of a word to help create the repetition. Remember, repetition for emphasis is often a very, very good thing. Careless repetition is the kind we don't want. So what we're talking about here, in terms of creating flow, creating coherence, we're talking about repetition for emphasis, the good kind. And then you also want parallel structure. And the way I explain parallel structure is each element of your sentence is in the same form. It's almost like a pattern. So if I said to you, last weekend I went swimming, hiking, and on a run. You get the idea. You know what I'm saying. You understand the meaning. But it doesn't flow right. It doesn't sound right. Because I broke up the pattern. Swimming, hiking, and running. Right? That's parallel structure. So using that can help create coherence in your writing as well. So, and right now we're looking more about the coherence of the whole essay, because in the next step we're going to look at each individual paragraph. Right? So at this point, ask yourself, is your thesis statement intelligent and clearly stated? Is your argument logically and effectively organized? Does the main idea of every paragraph relate directly to the thesis statement? Are the paragraphs fully developed with plenty of specific examples or illustrations to support the topic sentence of that paragraph? Do the ideas flow coherently? Are the transitions easy to follow from one main point to the next? And have you accomplished your purpose at this point? Does the paper make the point that you set out to prove? If you can answer yes to all of those, then we can move on to the next step, where we start looking at smaller sections of the essay. So level 3 is copy editing. Do you have a title, and is it an appropriate title? If applicable, do you have headings, proper headings? Do you have concise paragraphs? Remember, concise means not too wordy. Do you have consistent paragraphs? Do you need to improve on your sentences, and do you need to refine your use of language? So we're going to look at a couple of these. If you find that you're repeating things unnecessarily, you're getting too wordy, you might just need to do some sentence combining for conciseness. So usually with sentence combining, you've got two complete sentences, right? And you take an idea, the main idea from one sentence, and you kind of tuck it into a part of this second sentence, usually with some sort of modifier or phrase, and create a longer sentence, one longer sentence that accomplishes the same thing that the two separate sentences did, but in a way that is more elevated and more pleasing and helps get your point across faster. Alright, so I have an example here. It says, Twain savagely attacks conformity in the scene where the villagers stone the woman. The woman is suspected of being a witch. Those two sentences are so closely connected that we could easily take the main idea of the second sentence, the shorter one, and tuck it into the first sentence, like this. In a scene showing the villagers stoning a woman suspected of being a witch, Twain savagely attacks conformity. The second common stereotype is the dark lady. Usually the dark lady stereotype symbolizes sexual temptation. How about just the second common stereotype, comma, the dark lady, usually symbolizes sexual temptation. You don't have to have, you don't want to create run-on sentences or comma splices when you do this. So it does take some practice, but just think about how to make it sound natural. You can take main ideas from several sentences and create one single grammatically correct sentence that reads very smoothly and is easy to understand. So you can work on that to help create, to take care of that useless, careless repetition, and also it creates more variety and focus in your writing. You can rearrange rearrange the order of the words of your sentence so you can kind of play with syntax to gain emphasis and add variety. You can use dashes and set off by commas. You can use modifiers at the beginning of your sentences. You can have a short sentence. You don't want a whole bunch of short, choppy sentences because then that makes it kind of sound very childlike. But if you, for the most part, have, good length, well-developed, complex sentences, and then boom, all of a sudden there's this really short one, that can add emphasis and a very cool effect because it catches the reader off guard. So you can often say something very important in that moment that they will remember because their expectations were interrupted right there. So using a short sentence in the midst of regular length sentences can be very, very productive. And then using deliberate repetition is something that can add emphasis and variety as well. So there's a lot of things that you can play around with to help draw your reader attention to the ideas you really want them to remember. And again, it adds variety to your writing, and it just kind of kicks it up a level. You also want to think about wording at this stage of the revision process. So we've looked at getting rid of careless repetition by combining main ideas and creating longer sentences. We've looked at ways to rearrange or use different methods to create emphasis. Think about the words too. First, check to make sure that you're using lively verbs, not just forms of is. You don't want is, was, were, you want action verbs, right? True action verbs. Try to be as lively with your verbs as you can. Try to use active voice most of the time. Passive voice is okay from time to time, but for the most part you want to stay in active voice. And what I mean by that is active voice means that the subject of the sentence, the person or thing that is doing the action, that it's clear that that's the subject of the sentence, instead of being hidden further down in the sentence. So an example of that is, the boy was bitten by the dog. Well, the way that that sentence is worded right now, it makes it seem like the boy is the subject. And he is, but isn't the subject followed by the verb? And it's the subject who is performing the verb? But in this case, it's the boy was bitten. Well, that's not performing an action. The boy isn't doing anything with was bitten. So, if biting is the verb, what noun in that sentence did the biting? The dog. So, put it back in active voice. The dog bit the boy. Right? So not only does it clarify the focus of the sentence, but it also got rid of a whole bunch of unnecessary words. So using active voice is typically the best route to go. Think about the feeling of words. There's something, if you don't know the difference between denotation and connotation. Denotation is like the dictionary definition of a word. Connotation involves all of the associations and feelings that we have about a word. You can have a word like, even just a color, like red. If you're reading a story or watching a movie and someone is constantly dressed in the color red, if you look up the word red in the dictionary, it's just literally going to tell you that it's a color on the spectrum, blah, blah, blah. It's primary color, blah, blah, blah. There's not going to be anything in the dictionary that tells us that red can be used to convey different ideas or different feelings. Red can be used to convey, like, stop, right? Like stop sign, stoplight, or fire. Red can also be used to convey passion, anger, right? So think about word choices so that you're not adding a different layer of meaning to your argument than what you intended. Make sure that you set the tone for your essay in the very beginning and stick to it. And make sure that you are using formal language. You do not want to use too much informal language. Typically, you want to stay away from contractions. So instead of saying, it doesn't, it does not. A few contractions every once in a while is probably not going to be a big deal, but for the most part, you do want to avoid them. You want to avoid slang. You want to avoid sentence fragments. You want to avoid anything that smacks of texting lingo. And you want to avoid that informal language that we hear, in pop culture, right? That doesn't necessarily belong in academic writing. And you also want to use the third person approach. So you very rarely will refer to yourself in the first person. Instead of saying, I feel like this would be a mistake. Instead, you would want to say, many of us might feel like this is a mistake. So you want to use that second person as opposed to first person. That's something you definitely want to be aware of. So if you have all of that taken care of, you can move on to the last stage of editing and revising, which is proofreading. Proofreading is the level where you're going to look for spelling errors and grammar and mechanics. And it's the last one you're supposed to do, but typically the only one many of us do. First of all, if you're using Microsoft Word, use the features in Word to your advantage. It will mark all kinds of different things for you while you're typing. If you see anything with a blue or red line underneath it, dotted, squiggly, whatever, click on it and find out what the issue is. Use the spelling and grammar check as well. However, it will not pick up on everything. So you do need to go through the draft with a fine-tooth comb or have someone help you with that step to look for any errors that Microsoft Word misses, because it will miss some. One thing to do, read your writing out loud, read it backwards. You can go sentence by sentence backwards or like paragraph by paragraph backwards. But reading it out of order will make your mind focus on the sentences and not what you knew you meant to say there. Because your brain will trick you like that. If you're just reading it straight through from start to finish, you know what you intended to write. And while you're reading it, your brain will make that correction automatically. And it will sound completely fine to you. But on paper, it's not correct. So reading it backwards can help with that. Look for grammar and spelling. And I'm going to include some lessons for you. Because if you look here on, slide 19, we're looking at incorrect words, so like homonyms and, for example, there, and there, right? Word's not going to underline that or check it because it's spelled correctly, but you might not be using the right form. So check for those types of word issues. Check for regular spelling issues, and then grammar and mechanics. So here I have 3 in particular that you want to make sure that you've checked on throughout your essay. Sentence fragments, run-on sentences and comma splices, and faulty modifiers. We've already talked about sentence combining and passive and active voice. I am going to include a module at the very end of the course content. So after the last week of the course, after the last module, there'll be a module there that says grammar and mechanics. There will be lessons in that module on these types of issues. You can go there and look over the handout that explains that error, and then there's also a video where I go through the handout and explain the error. And then there's examples at the bottom of the handout that I'll go over in the video as well. So if you're not sure what some of these errors are, you can go there and get a little refresher. If you're going through the lessons and you're like, I've never heard of this, I have no idea what this is, reach out to me and I will give you more help on those. You might just wait until you get your draft back. And if you see that I have marked a lot of sentence fragments or a lot of run-ons and comma splices, then you might want to come back to the lessons and just brush up on those things as well. But that is where level 4 takes you, is into those smaller details. And we do not want to worry about those smaller details until the very end, because if you worry about them first, and then it turns out that that whole paragraph it shouldn't have even been in the essay in the first place, you've just wasted all that time and energy correcting all those little teeny tiny errors when you didn't need to, because the bigger errors, the global issues, need to be taken care of first. Right? And the last thing I want to end with here on the revision process is about peer reviews. And I know a lot of students have bad experiences with peer reviews. They really don't understand what the purpose is. They don't really seem to, you know, be effective. You don't really get good feedback. But I just want you to think about, for a moment, how useful a peer review can be to both people involved. And when you are the author of the paper and you are giving it to a classmate to review, if your instructor does not already provide you with a list of questions that the other person is supposed to look at and answer about your paper, then you need to provide them with specific questions that you would like them to address about your essay, and not just things that are yes or no answers. You ask them, is my introduction good? Did it grab your attention? Can you figure out where my thesis statement is? Can you figure out what my main points are? Could you tell by the topic sentence? Do you think that my paragraph stayed on focus? I have this topic sentence here. Did I stay on topic? Just you ask them questions. Encourage them to be honest, but don't get defensive. And ultimately make your own decisions. If they give you a whole bunch of advice and feedback, that's great, but it's ultimately your decision if you use it. Now, if you are the reader, don't feel like you can't be helpful. You know the assignment requirements too. You had to write the same assignment. You know when you read something, you know if you understand what you're reading. And you know when something is confusing and all over the place. You know when something isn't explained well enough. You know when something isn't convincing. So even if you feel like your writing skills are not as strong as other students, you do know how to tell if what you're reading is good or if it needs work. None of us are filmmakers, but we know when a movie could have been better. We know when it could have been more effective. You can provide useful feedback, even though you're all in the same boat and none of you are, masters at writing essays. It's okay. You're not grading it. The instructor is grading it. You're just trying to help your friend, your classmate, do better. Help them make it stronger. It's also beneficial to both people because when you read someone else's essay and you have to answer those specific questions, it helps you strengthen your own understanding of essay elements. And it could be like, oh my gosh, I can't find the thesis statement in this person's introductory paragraph. What do I do? Well, be honest, right? And then when you talk about it with them afterwards, be like, I couldn't find your thesis statement. Did I miss something? And then the two of you can look at the introductory paragraph together, and maybe that person says, you know what, you're right. I don't have it worded clearly enough. It's not, you can't tell. I need to work on that. Or the person says, no, it's right here, and points to it in the introduction. And then you're like, oh, right. Okay, I missed that. I need to work on being able to identify them better. So either way, you're helping each other with your own strengths and weaknesses, right? It is not about grading it and saying, this is exactly what you need to do to make this essay perfect. No. It's working together to build upon your own strengths and weaknesses and lift each other up to create something even better. Okay? It's just in review here, go global to local when you're revising. Look at those bigger issues first, go through each step, right? So you're starting big and then you're getting a little more focused, a little smaller every step of the way, and then you end with those local issues of grammar and mechanics and spelling. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. But just, keep all of this in mind and try not to skip any of these